So let's move on to the internet weather and see what's been going on. Not too many real big news stories here. So this first chart here is our top 10 most probe ports. This was basically the most number of probes, irrespective of how many devices were actually doing it. So one device could send 80 billion scan probes and it would show up high in here, as opposed to some coordinated activity. So I'm not a big fan of the most probes because it doesn't really show you trends as much. But what we do see is 22 TCP is your SSH. That's usually at the top. We know there's a lot of brute forcing activity going on, looking for things like these IoT-based devices. I bet you money that the one you were just talking about has an SSH port on it for administration. This is the kind of thing that these actors are scanning for when they're going against 22 TCP. 135 TCP is your NetBIOS type stuff going on there. 1900 UDP is SSDP, Simple Service Discovery Protocol. We've been seeing a lot more distributed denial of service type attacks, reflection attacks, similar to your DNS reflection attacks with SSDP. Still not scaled to the point that they're anywhere near the size of DNS or NTP type reflection attacks, but still, it's a port that's out there that, since it's UDP, you can do reflection across it, spoof source, and have it bounce off to its victim. So people are looking for these so that they can use them as part of their attack suite when they want to do reflective-based attacks. 445 TCP SMB, that's moved up a couple of points, but most of this stuff is pretty steady. 8080 TCP, we're going to take a look at that one in a little more detail to see. It's moved up 3 positions, but it's actually been very gradually rising up here more than it had been. 23 TCP Telnet, so that's another one very similar to SSH that is also running on a lot of these IoT type devices, your home DVRs, your disk storage devices, network attached storage type things, home routers, etc. Still have Telnet open and people are scanning for it. 80 TCP web, people are always scanning for that. There could be various reasons for that. 1433 TCP Microsoft SQL Server, that's moved up 4 positions, but it's the scanning activity is pretty steady on that one, so I didn't bring a chart up on this one because it's been elevated and high for a while, but no significant upturns or downturns. It's just been more than, a little bit more than usual. Remote desktop protocol, we always see activity on that. Again, that's looking for interactive access. You got all these bad actors out there they'll brute force their way into those too, and there's some worms that do that as well, like Mordo has been around for years that looks for RDP-based devices and tries to brute force their way in with password guessing. And then 443 TCP, notorious for various reasons. People might be scanning it, like Heartbleed and other things that are still lingering around, or other types of, what's the Freak one that's out, that came out. So there's other vulnerabilities people are scanning for in 443 TCP lately as well. Although it's moved down quite significantly as compared to last week.
And we don't know if they're scanning for vulnerabilities in SSL or in the underlying sites.
Yes, we don't know.
Running on 443.
Yeah, we just know that they're just scanning on that particular port for this. This is, so instead of looking at, actually maybe I didn't pull up the 8080 chart, or maybe it's later, but instead of looking at what we had on that previous chart, I was going to say I want to take a look at what we don't see that we used to see a lot. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is port 9064 TCP. We had talked about that a lot in the beginning of this year, a little bit in the last half of last year, where we went from nothing up to quite significant amounts of scanning, peaking up here at 250 million scan flows per hour. This is what I never really was able to. I know it's a proxy port, but I don't know why there's so many proxies hanging out on 9064 TCP. But there are. You can find them in proxy lists out on the internet. Some of these people who collect lists up, and I don't know if there's a specific tool or a specific piece of proxy software, like Squid is notorious for hanging out on 3128. I don't know why 9064 TCP is so popular. But the thing I thought was interesting is when the past week or week and a half or so, it's really gone back down to nothing again. So whoever was scanning for that has kind of given up. Or maybe they got all the information they need. Most of it's coming from China. We know China scans a lot for proxies because it helps them, get access to things that, basically anonymize their traffic. So interesting that there's a downturn on that one. I'm kind of curious to see if it comes back up again at some point. But I guess we'll find out. So this is the top 10 most sources probing. I tend to like this chart a lot better because it means that there's a lot of devices doing things in unison or in some kind of coordinated fashion, which typically is indicative of botnet-related activity or some other type of botnetish-like thing going on. 3.3 ICMP, I think that might be an echo request port unreachable. I think that's a reply with port unreachable. That could just be, backscatter from scanning activity. Probably not significant, other than it might have something to do with some of these UDP ones, because I think they send back ICMP unreachables when you make a UDP request. 445 TCP we already talked about. SMB 8.0 echo requests is up a little bit. These are probably not, the ICMP ones are probably not really that security relevant. 27015 UDP is gaming related. That's up a point or up one position from last week. That's really not security relevant. Although I will mention that 27015 UDP can be used for reflection attacks as well. I don't know how much amplification you get with that, but I know that and this is Valve's Half-Life gaming server, typically runs on 27015 UDP. And since it is UDP, you can use it as a spoofed, and you can do some reflection off of it. But I haven't really seen a lot of attacks with that yet, but they might just be doing recon to find them. So they get a list together.
Yeah, well, and I do find it interesting that that's clear up to number 4 now. I mean, I remember when it first crept into the charts early last year, I think, and now it's up to number 4 most sources probing.
Right. And it's really, this is a weird port because I'm familiar with Half-Life and how it works. And when you bring your game browser up, it almost acts very much like a scanning thing, because it gets a list of all of these game servers that are out there. It could be thousands. And then it goes and tries to reach each one of them. So, even though that's legitimate activity, it's somebody running a game client trying to get status of how fast can I talk to each one of these servers that are on my list. It looks like scanning activity to us. So it's hard to differentiate between that legitimate activity versus someone scanning it for potentially malicious purposes or reflection. So I'm not aware if there's any new games that would make this surge up, like you said, Jim, higher than it had used to be, but it's probably one to watch, especially to see if there is reflection attacks going on there. 6881 UDP is BitTorrent. I'm not quite sure why this is pretty much static at position 6. I'm not quite sure why that one is in here, other than since it is peer-to-peer, there's probably, it can also very similarly look like random scanning, because peer-to-peer, you're talking to a lot of different peers on those ports, so that's probably why that's in there. Although you might be able to reflection off of this one as well. Pretty much any UDP you technically could, if somebody's listening and you know how to ask the question correctly, you could get some reflected traffic back. ADTCP is up. Again, this one didn't really look like it is up that significantly compared to volumetrics of what we've seen before. The real interesting ones, in my opinion, are these 4183 and 4143 UDPs, which you guys talked about last week. I wasn't here for the show, but I was digging around a little bit in this one too. So we've got some interesting slides here. Not quite sure what to attribute this to yet, other than it's probably some kind of peer-to-peer mechanism for talking, but we're going to take a look at a slide in a second. And then 8080 TCP is the last one. I think I have a slide on it, but if I don't, this is, yeah, actually I know I do. It's in here. Here it is. So let's talk about the 8080 TCP first. This is HTTP alternate. So it's well known as being used as kind of an alternate port. Normally port 80 is your web traffic, but 8080 TCP is used quite frequently as an alternate port, a lot of times for proxies or administrative interfaces for various types of things. Like Tomcat, I know I mentioned that one before, is used quite a bit on port 8080, the administrative interface. And I think some of these other like web management tools might also listen on 8080. I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but there's a couple other tools for like managing your web server that sit on port 8080. The takeaway here is that there is kind of a trend line that was kind of pretty, static around it looks like 500 scan sips per hour. We're looking at scan sips here, not the number of scan flows. And then it's kind of very dramatically gone up. There's this upward trend line here reaching into the 3,500 scan sips per hour, if I'm reading this correctly. So there's definitely an upturn of coordinated scanning activity on this. What I would say is, I've said this before, if you're running Tomcat, if you're running Cold Fusion web server, not that this runs on 8080, a lot of those things, a lot of those types of web suites have administrative ports running on these alternate types of ports that people are looking for. It shouldn't be open to the internet. Close them if you have them directly connected to the internet, or at least filter access to them so that only you can get to them, or some trusted subnet range that you know you're always going to come from when you go to reach the administrative port for these types of services. So let's look at 4143 UDP and 4183 UDP. This is a real interesting one. We don't really know what it is, although I have some packets that we're going to look at in a second here. The 4143 UDP appears that it's mostly sources in the United States, for the most part, scanning for that particular port. And 4183 is mostly ones in Latin America and Europe. When we did a couple of poking around at a few of them just to try to fingerprint them, a lot of them look like various types of IoT type devices, these little embedded devices. But there's no real clear, to me, there's no real clear commonality between all of them. You know, a lot of them don't have any ports open that I can see. And the ones that we do see don't have the same types of ports open, or they're not the same types of devices. So I'm kind of curious how these are getting compromised, if this is a compromise. I don't really know what this is yet, other than the fact that all this scanning activity, you know, we went from pretty much nothing up to 5,000 scan sources per hour. It all started, I guess, what is this, the 26th, March 26th? And there was nothing, absolutely nothing prior to that. So that's an interesting one to keep an eye at. When I took a look at, here's a picture of the geographic distribution. So you can see on 4143 that there's a very heavy concentration in North America. Not to say that there isn't some smattering in other parts of the world, but it's very concentrated in North America. And then when you look at the 4183, it's not hardly anything in North America, and most of it's located in South America and concentrations in Europe there. So why that is, I don't know, because we don't really know what this is yet. If anybody out there knows, please write to us. We'll give you the address at the end of the show. We'd like to know a little bit more about this, but to me, this looks like some kind of peer-to-peer thing, because we don't know anything that really runs on these ports that would be listening, so it's kind of curious. I'd like to find out more about what that is. Here's a picture of the a couple of packets, just to show you what's actually in the payload. I call this the Mac and the Mad packets. So on port 4143, it's just got 16 bytes of payload. I've obfuscated out the IP addresses involved in this activity, but or I just kind of blurred them out. There's really nothing intelligible in here to me. I don't recognize this pattern. The word MAC appears in the middle. That could just be coincidence, that whatever that byte, whatever this message is, it might not really mean anything. It might just be part of a binary happy accident kind of thing that happened there. But on 4183, the message has MAD, and there's a few different byte patterns in here too. So they have a B7 in the 4th byte, and 1C instead of F4, 0B instead of 0A. So what to make of that, I don't know. But again, if anybody else recognizes this, that watches the show, recognizes this byte pattern of traffic, we'd like to find out more about what this actually is.